Without DNA, how do we know who the father of the child is? There are different ways to establish paternity before DNA testing became widely accessible. The courts relied on a variety of methods in order to determine if a man was, in fact, the biological father of a child. Today, DNA testing is the most reliable and accurate way to establish paternity. However, there have been instances where this testing has either been inconclusive or has not been possible. So, what are the other ways that paternity can be established? And how did the courts use these methods before DNA testing? No. 1. The father's name on the birth certificate. Before we had DNA testing, it was common for the father's name to be placed on the birth certificate. This would normally be done with the mother's consent, and often this would take place at the hospital shortly after the baby was born. In some cases, however, a man may agree to have his name put on a birth certificate when he is not actually the biological father. In those situations, once doubts are cast on his paternity, he will then have to prove through other means that he is not the father. In countries where fathers have to register their name with the state in order to receive child support payments, this could lead to more situations where men have to prove they are not the father. As well as proving a negative is very difficult, especially without DNA testing. Previously, the courts used a number of different methods in order to prove negative paternity. We will look at some of these later in this video. But first, let's return to positive proof of paternity. In addition to the father's name being on the birth certificate, there were other ways to establish paternity before DNA testing. One of these ways was through something known as an admission by conduct. This type of evidence is similar to a confession in a criminal trial. If the alleged father admits that he is the father either orally or in writing, then this can be used to establish paternity. In many jurisdictions, this type of admission can be used even if it is made after the birth of the child. Also, similar to the criminal law concept of a chain of custody, an admission by conduct can be used even if it is made out of court. Another way paternity could be proven without DNA testing was through something known as an acknowledgement of paternity. Similar to an admission by conduct, this is a statement made either orally or in writing by the alleged father which establishes paternity. What makes this method different from an admission by conduct is that an acknowledgement of paternity must take place after the birth of the child. Furthermore, the acknowledgement of paternity must meet certain statutory requirements depending on the jurisdiction. For example, in California, the acknowledgement of paternity must be executed in the presence of a notary public or other authorized official. In some jurisdictions, both parents must sign the acknowledgement of paternity form. Each parent also typically has the right to revoke an acknowledgement of paternity within a certain time frame, usually 30 days, although this varies by location. Similar to an admission by conduct, an acknowledgement of paternity can be used to establish paternity even if it is made out of court. If none of these methods were used, then it was up to the person alleging paternity to prove it in court. Traditionally, the courts would use a variety of different methods in order to make this determination. Some of the more common methods included a showing of opportunity, a showing of reputation, and lastly, through expert testimony. A showing of opportunity is exactly what it sounds like. If the alleged father had the opportunity to be with the mother when the child was conceived, then this can help establish paternity. This showing, however, is not enough on its own to establish paternity. A showing of reputation is when the alleged father has been held out to the public as the child's father. Again, similar to a showing of opportunity, this is not enough on its own to establish paternity, but can be used in combination with other evidence to do so. Lastly, an individual may testify as an expert witness about their blood group findings. Blood typing was used prior to DNA testing and was considered much more accurate than the other methods mentioned. However, it should be noted that blood typing is not foolproof and can lead to false positives and false negatives. With that said, blood typing can still be used today as a useful tool in establishing paternity, although it is not as commonly used as DNA testing. In fact, many courts require blood typing before allowing a DNA test to take place. So what happens if the results of these methods cast doubt on paternity, or if they fail to establish paternity? If the evidence fails to establish paternity or casts doubt on the alleged father's ability to be the biological father, then the courts will sometimes allow for a new test known as exclusionary testing to take place. During exclusionary testing, the alleged father, mother, and child all give DNA samples. If the results exclude the alleged father as the biological father, then the paternity will be denied. However, just because the alleged father is excluded as the biological father does not mean that he is definitely not the biological father. It is important to note that while these types of tests can be very useful, they are not foolproof, and there is always a small margin of error. Now let's shift our attention to those situations where the alleged father does not admit to being the father, and he wants to prove that he is not the father. In these situations, the alleged father will need to use one of two defenses, either a denial of parentage or a challenge to the legitimacy of the child. A denial of parentage is a defense used when the alleged father contends that he is not the biological father. This defense is similar to a criminal defendant pleading not guilty. The burden of proof in this type of case is on the person alleging paternity. This means that the person alleging paternity must prove by a preponderance of the evidence that the alleged father is in fact the father. As discussed above, the primary method of establishing paternity is through DNA testing. However, as a defense attorney, I have had several paternity cases where my client was able to successfully deny paternity using other methods. For example, in one case, my client was able to successfully deny paternity by showing that he was out of the country at the time the child could have been conceived. In another case, my client was able to successfully deny paternity by showing that he and the mother had regular and consistent use of contraception around the time the child was conceived. A challenge to the legitimacy of the child is a defense that can be raised when the alleged father contends that the child is not legitimate. This defense is available to the alleged father in situations such as when the child was conceived through rape or when the mother misrepresented her marital status. Under this defense, the alleged father does not need to prove that he is not the biological father, but rather that the child was not born within the bounds of a valid marriage or civil union. If the alleged father is successful in proving that the child is illegitimate, then paternity will be denied regardless of his biological relationship to the child. In conclusion, while DNA testing is the most reliable and accurate way to establish paternity, there have been instances where this has either been inconclusive or has not been possible. Therefore, the courts have developed other methods for establishing paternity. These methods include a showing of opportunity, a showing of reputation, expert testimony, and in some cases, an admission by conduct or acknowledgement of paternity. In those situations where DNA testing is inconclusive or impossible, the courts will sometimes allow for a new test known as exclusionary testing to take place. If exclusionary testing is successful, then the alleged father will be excluded as the biological father and paternity will be denied. On the other hand, if exclusionary testing is unsuccessful, then the courts will likely turn to other methods of establishing paternity. I hope you found this video to be helpful. Please feel free to comment below with any questions you may have. I will try to answer your questions in a timely manner. Additionally, if you would like to receive updates whenever I post new videos, please make sure to subscribe. I look forward to providing you with helpful legal information in future videos. Thank you for watching.